Warsaw in the Second World War. You might think of the Jewish ghetto uprising that occurred in 1943, or perhaps the bigger Warsaw uprising that took place in the following year. But what about the Siege of Warsaw? That took place in 1939. It is like one of these forgotten World War II battles that got overshadowed by the darker events that occurred later. In this video, we're going to talk about the Siege of Warsaw. Stay tuned. Hey, welcome back on the channel and welcome to another forgotten World War II battle episode, where I am standing here in the old town, or actually the reconstructed old town of Warsaw. The old town got completely obliterated after the failed Warsaw Uprising of 1944, but also sustained severe damage during the Siege of Warsaw. The castle you see behind me there did not survive the siege. When the Germans invaded Poland, 1st of September 1939, the first shots were fired by the battleship of Schleswig-Holstein located at Westerplatte. This actually happened after the Glanwitz incident, which was a false flag attack perpetrated by the Germans to provide an excuse for their invasion. The Wehrmacht's plan was to invade Poland simultaneously from the north, west and east. Its advance had to be swift and ruthless, using both armored columns and the Luftwaffe to catch the Poles before they could establish proper lines of defense. Army Group North formations attacked from Pomerania and East Prussia. Its priorities were to link up across the Danzig corridor and advance southeast on Warsaw. Being sporadically bombed, the bombing campaigns of the Germans intensified after September 3rd. One Varsovian wrote in his diary, "Constant air raid alarms. Our daily life is now a constant journey between the basement and the apartment. And now it is clear to all that, although we are not on the front line, the front is actually above us. The war is being fought overhead." The inhabitants adapted to war life the best they could. Trams and buses were provided with blue dim lights, and the inhabitants also used strips of tape on the windows that, in case of shattered glass, not many people would be injured. Inhabitants were informed via radio that they had to help with digging trenches for the defense of the city.
Soldiers requisitioned civilians on the streets and directed them to construct trenches. Civilians and soldiers ripped out rails from the ground and used them to block the path of tanks. More than 100 streetcars were overturned. It seemed as if the enemy would have to conquer the city building by building.
Now, initially the mood was upbeat, especially when the Poles learned that the French and the British had declared war on Germany and were thus on their side. However, this soon changed as more and more refugees poured into the city, and they brought with them horror stories of German atrocities against soldiers and civilians. Now, this was strengthened by a general military withdrawal behind the Vistula on September 6th, and shortly after, the government abandoned the city. On the 8th of September, the decision was taken to defend the capital by establishing an improvised Warsaw Army Group under command of General Julius Rommel, who was fresh from his failure as commander of the WWII army and was accused of having abandoned his troops on the battlefield. Worse still, in the abject chaos that now typified the Polish High Command, Rommel's precise position in Warsaw remained undefined. No one seemed to know what role he was to take, or what forces he had at his disposal. When the head of Warsaw's defense command, General Valerian Czuma, was asked what Rommel was doing, he replied that he didn't know. "He has visited my headquarters," he said, "but that is all." One column of the German 4th Panzer Division reached the outskirts of the city on September 10th, but they were driven back. The Poles were willing to defend their capital city. The military had also placed a large concentration of artillery on the east bank of the city that was willing to fire in the city once the enemy entered it. As the Germans surrounded the city, food became scarce and bread queues became more common. So was carving up dead horses for meat that were lying on the streets. The siege was extensively photographed by Julian Bryan, an American journalist who was in Warsaw during the siege.
I was in a city about to face perhaps the worst siege of all modern history. The Polish government, together with foreign correspondents, had left the capital. There were sandbags in front of certain buildings, paper stickers over the plate glass of store windows. I saw only a few closed stores. Streetcars were still running, but they were jammed. Even newspaper vendors felt obligated to continue their work. I filmed the preparations for the defense of Warsaw.
Germans were in no hurry to take the city, and General Halder was willing to starve the city and surrender. September 16th, the Germans demanded the surrender of the city, but this was refused. Things looked very bleak because the Slovakians attacked Poland from the south, and so did the Soviets from the east. The next day, the Polish government made it to Romania. Warsaw suffered heavy bombardments from the 20th of September by over 600 aircraft. The Polish Air Force was no match for the German Air Force, and the defenders lacked effective anti-aircraft guns. Later, incendiaries were also dropped. An estimated 25,000 civilians and 6,000 soldiers perished in the German bombing campaigns of 1939 on Warsaw. The city was also subjected to massive artillery fire that added to the death toll and scale of destruction. With propaganda leaflets thrown out over the city, the Germans tried to win over the civilian population. Leaflets were intended to intimidate, to demand the city's surrender, to reiterate Poland's predicament and the failings of her military and leadership, and to threaten further bombing if the city's defenders did not comply. But both the mangled Polish grammar and the empty promises of fair treatment for prisoners aroused little except a cynical smile. We received leaflets like those in broken Polish every day, and we laughed at the spelling mistakes, one observer wrote. On September 26th, another heavy bombing followed. Residential areas were targeted instead of strategic ones. So did the German artillery. It was a war of terror that was waged.
Every afternoon, the enemy squadrons launched firebombs. At night, entire sections of the city were in flames. When the bombs began to fall, mothers were evacuated to the cellars with their children. They were only a few days old. Their lives had just begun, and they were already victims of war.
The Germans soon attacked the suburbs and targeted the fortresses that surrounded the city. Bitter fighting ensued. On the same day, the military commanders of Warsaw came together to discuss whether or not to continue the fight over the city. General Kutrzeba said that further resistance would mean pointless suicide, the killing of the population and the destruction of the city. After this meeting, Commander Rommel decided to capitulate. In the early morning of September 27th, a ceasefire followed. As Kutrzeba met up with the Germans to sign the unconditional capitulation, he later recalled, "A stifled pain tears the soul. I must clench my teeth, nail my thoughts to some secondary fact, dull my spirit to swallow that burst of tears. I am choking on pain. I can barely contain the tears." Warsaw surrendered on October 1st. The fighting against the invaders would continue for some days after. Shortly after, 140,000 soldiers that defended Warsaw, they gathered on the agreed assembly point and marched into captivity, into an uncertain future. But this was only the beginning. Now, if you want to know more about German occupation of Poland during World War II, you can click right here. Consider becoming a patron, because with your donations I can keep doing this and expand. Thank you so much for watching. See you later.